introduction. But before I invite him to speak, and I'm really looking forward to this because Valerian's work has, and generally work on Ambedkar has really looked at social rather than the idea of the state, except for constitution making and so on, which is obvious fact. So I really look forward to this new departure in Ambedkar study. So with that, I welcome Professor Rodrigues. Before actually asking him to get into the act of speaking, let me make 3 quick announcements. One is that on the 15th of this month, 5:30 p.m., please note, 5:30 p.m. at the auditorium. Yeah, 5:30 p.m. That's why I underlined 5:30 p.m. This is the Ekwar Shastra Prasad Memorial Lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. K. Ullas Karan. He's from the Science Asia Wildlife Conservation Society and Center for Wildlife Studies in Bengaluru. And the subject of his talk will be recovering nature in a crowded subcontinent. The second announcement is for 16th April, that's tomorrow at 3 p.m. It's a public lecture on interrogating social justice theory. This is a thematic, and it's going to be delivered by Dr. K. Satyanarayan, from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. And the title of his talk will be Caste, Identity and Dalit Movements in Contemporary South India. And the third announcement is for 17th April, that's the day after, 3 p.m. again, a public lecture, which is a series on India and the wider world. And this will be delivered by Professor Susan Pennybacker of the University of North Carolina, USA. And the title is Fire by Night, Cloud by Day, Indians, South Africans and Trinidadians remember post-war Cold War London. So with these small announcements, I will invite Professor Rodrigues.
Thank you, Professor Datta, and thank you to Kinmurthy, particularly to Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, for inviting me to speak on this theme, particularly in the series. I have been looking into some ideas of Ambedkar, particularly with regard to the way he built up a relationship between democracy, culture, nation, the concept of the human. And I wrote this presentation in that particular series, so it's back and forth. And there are some things which should have come in this, but since they have gone into the other slots, I am not raising some of these particular issues. The paper is written, and I hope I would have about 45 minutes. And large part of the paper I would like to read. I have taken the following approach to explore the idea of the state in Baba Saheb Ambedkar. The idea of the state and the reality of the state pre-existed him. He is not its inventor. He has no copyright over it, neither claimed it. But in the process of working on this idea, which the complex traditions that engaged with this idea initiated him to, he provided a specific twist to it, highlighting certain elements of the idea, and in the process redrawing its map, which I believe had and probably have had profound consequences both for our idea of the state and engagement with it. I believe that he himself has suggested this approach while working on several other issues, particularly while drafting the constitutional text of India. In one of the interventions in the assembly, in the beginning, he discounted originality and innovativeness in framing provisions of the Constitution, which many members of the Constituent Assembly clamored for, arguing that much thinking has already been invested on the issues that they raised, and any exercise in this regard can proceed only by engaging with such thinking. And I believe it takes a similar approach with regard to the idea of the state. Clearly, the approach adopted here is quite different from excavating the different nuances of the concept from his copious writings, or genealogical, that is, founding an ancestry to the concept. This endeavor also avoids the complex detour of our historical sociology, believing that it is difficult to warrant the causal relations that it calls for in an exercise of this kind. It is not important for this approach whether the idea of the state is contested or not, or what are its plans. What we are interested in is the slide that this concept undergoes, including the contestations in Ambedkar's writings. Ambedkar also worked on other ideas close to the state, particularly democracy, and read different nuances into them. This is particularly so with regard to democracy. There has been a powerful tradition of thought which identified democracy with sovereign power, drawn from the Republican and Soviet traditions, ably highlighted by Rousseau on one hand and Lenin on the other. Ambedkar deeply appreciated this tradition, but distinguished between democracy and the state, while suggesting a specific relation of priority to democracy with regard to their pursuit. Given this approach, the following texts of Ambedkar are helpful to pursue this paper. Certain documents such as Evidence before the Southborough Committee, 1919, the statements that he drafted on behalf of the Vice-Krit Hitakarini Sabha for submission to the Indian Statutory Commission or the Simon Commission, 1928. His own evidence before the Commission, 1928. His note to the Indian Franchise Committee or the Lothian Committee, 1932. His interventions at the Round Table Conference, 1930-1932. Full-length studies such as Thoughts on Pakistan, 1940. What Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables, 1945, and Thoughts on Linguistic States, 1955, and bills such as the Constitution of India and the Hindu Code Bill that bore his imprint. All these texts play a major role in designing the architecture of modern Indian state. There are other texts that suggest a moral basis to the Indian state, such as The Annihilation of Caste, Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah, and Buddha and his Dharma, written in 1935, 1940, and 1957 respectively, to which I would draw attention as I proceed. There is an argument that has come up in recent years with complex history, which suggests that the astounding initiative that Dalit movement displayed in democratizing and injecting a reflective fervor in Indian society came to be rerouted into the bureaucratic legal register, reconstructing caste violence and Dalit body to very different systemic usages in post-colonial India. I am referring to the argument of Anupama Rao in the caste question. This is, I believe, her argument, if I understand this book correctly. Therefore, it's a vicious circle that Anupama Rao's argument is caste violence and Dalit body, in the post-colonial India, the whole Dalit movement which displayed such a great creativity came to be rooted in the bureaucratic legal register, reconstructing caste violence and Dalit body to very different systemic usages in post-colonial India. And she argues in this book that this is a vicious circle that reproduces itself over time. While Ambedkar gets much credit for the first, that is democratic intervention, he is largely absolved from blame with regard to the second, that is, his co-option of the Dalit movement into the bureaucratic legal trajectory. I wish to suggest that Ambedkar is very much involved in the formulation of the architecture of independent India, and some of his deepest agonies and valiant battles, withdrawal from public life, and yet other initiatives are deeply bound with it. He thought that a democratic project can be realized only by engaging with the state project rather than deserting the ramparts of a constitutional democracy to the beguiling expanses of the social, as probably Anupama suggests. At the same time, he argued that social agency in the changed context cannot be precipitated by merely invoking its past, but by showing up the democratic project with a distinct set of foundational values. A sustained engagement with the state, while at the same time pursuing a democratic project in a deeply diverse society, has its twists and turns and setbacks. But he felt that other seemingly simpler solutions are no solutions at all. However, it is worth mentioning right at the start that this endeavor was not short of deadlocks and traps, including the loneliness of the long-distance runner in the last 5 years of his eventful life. It might be good for us to enumerate certain meeting places for his ideas on the state. Meeting places, as we all know, do not necessarily suggest causal connection with thought, but could suggest lines of march, horizons to be respected, missing links, and issues to contemplate. They could also beget durable effects in our dispositions by attuning us to perceive issues in specific ways. Certain endeavors and personages he drew attention constantly, such as the teachings and sayings of Kabir, the alternative imagination of the nation proposed by Phule, the invocation of the domain of rights by Ranade, etc., in both, played a major role in his thinking. In both his doctoral dissertations that considered aspects of the colonial state in India, Ambedkar dwelt extensively how this state crafted itself, partly falling back on the resources of the Mughal state to meet the requirements of organizing power on one hand, and to subserve the interests of Britain, particularly British economy. Ambedkar was also deeply influenced by the processes of the working of the US at the beginning of the 20th century, when knowledge, quote unquote, came to be consciously deployed in the building of public institutions and shaping policy. The influence of John Dewey remained pervasive throughout his life. The Fabianism of LSE in the first 2 decades of the 20th century and the radical tinge and sensitivity of Edwin Montague cannot be ignored. Those of you familiar with Ambedkar would know that Edwin was very close to Edwin Montague, and Edwin Montague was a very different kind of a presence in the emerging labor politics in Britain. The national movement, and particularly Gandhi, provided a context to argue the case of the ignored and suggest alternative possibilities for their inclusion. There were the incipient Dalit insurgencies across the country, manifest in molecular ways to engage with. The colonial state was both an adversary and a zone of opportunity. Above all, there was the everyday endeavor of constructing the post-colonial state in association with others, all the while aware that if you do not define your space, others would invariably and spontaneously set their terms on you. For Ambedkar, the state was a resource to further and foster democracy. In another paper that I have written, I have argued that for him, a democratic polity is made of the willing participation of its members and is responsive and accountable to the citizen community as a whole. Its strivings, goals and purposes are not given in advance, but formulated and redrawn by the political community itself. If there are any restrictions in such an endeavor, they are meant to facilitate the decisions and actions of the community, and they can be altered by the community at will. In other words, a democracy is not fettered by a set of pre-existing considerations which stipulate the goals of a polity, except those required for the sustenance and reproduction of a community made of free and equal members. And this is my argument. Now let me come to the on democracy, and I think Ambedkar has a kind of relationship between democracy and state, very problematic relationship. I have used a particular understanding of power in this, and I have fallen back upon the work of Stephen Dew, the latest 2008 edition of the concept of power, and I would use it as an analytical tool. But let me make that concept of power before you, present the concept of power before you. The state, generally understood as an organized political community that claims supreme power over a determinate territory, was little subjected to sustained interrogation and reflective consideration for state during the independent movement. This is interesting given the fact, and there is a universal agreement in this regard, that India had a distinct tradition with regard to the state in terms of the concept of dharma-danda relation. And some of the most creative dimensions of Muslim political thought in India came to be focused on the nature of sovereign authority, particularly the work of Jawaharlal in the 13th century and Abul Fazl in the 16th century. Much of the nationalist discourse seemed to accept the state as a fact of life, and this is very strange. Other considerations had an overriding say, and often ideas of nationalism came to trump considerations on state. Subsequently, academic discourse on state has remained highly derivative, mainly focusing on its variants in Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Hegel, and Marxist body of thought. Conceptions with regard to the nature of public power, the relation between sovereign and subject, the relation across subjects themselves, and the relation between containing entities that describe themselves as public power have not been subjected to serious and sustained investigation in modern Indian thought or later in the academia. Ranade opened it up, particularly with regard to the history of Maratha polity, but it did not find much of a continuity. Savarkar took up this issue, but soon collapsed it into the idea of nation. Ambedkar is one of the first who consistently reflected upon the state and made the state not merely his object of attention in his early writings on the colonial state, but subsequently with regard to the possibility of constructing an independent state in India with all the problems. To begin with, let me first consider state as a variant of power. Power is the capacity, power is the capacity of ordering, in the sense of organizing, a specific mode of life and directing course of events. Such organizing and directing can be done not merely by initiating, deciding and vetoing the actions of discrete individuals and groups, but also by limiting such events and confining ways of life and course of events to relatively safe issues. Limiting decisions or confining them within a specific scope is itself an exercise of power. We all know this, how people do this. An explicit decision may not be made to confine issues. Social structures and political processes may have such effect. Therefore, power involves both decision-making and non-decision-making. Power tends to identify certain issues for decision-making, while non-decision-making leaves out of focus or account other important or key issues, including the manner and scope of making decisions themselves. Stephen Hughes calls the above two conceptions of power as one-dimensional and two-dimensional respectively, and advances in their place what he considers as a three-dimensional conception of power. According to him, the bias manifest in the exercise of power is not merely limited to a series of individually chosen acts, but also most importantly by the socially structured and culturally patterned behavior of groups and practices of institutions. Power might be manifest not merely in cases of conflict, but, to quote him, the most effective and insidious use of power is to prevent such conflict from arising in the first place. Unquote. Further, power can be developed to prevent people from having grievances, again to quote him, by shaping their perceptions, cognitions, and preferences in such a way that they accept their role in the existing order of things, either because they can see or imagine no alternative to it, or because they see it as natural and unchangeable, or because they value it as divinely ordained and beneficial. I am using this of Stephen Hughes, 2008 book, partly because you contend against the work of Bourdieu and also the work of Foucault while arguing a definition of power in this sense. And it helps me to see Ambedkar's way of negotiating power in general and state power in a much better way. I find the distinction that Hughes makes with regard to the different dimensions of power is useful to probe into the way Ambedkar read the threefold relation, that is, relation between state and citizens, relation between citizens themselves, and relation between citizens on one hand, other claimants of power. Different modes of structuring power. Ambedkar argued that power is differently structured in India. Therefore, shifting of colonial authority to the national popular ground system, shifting of authority to the national popular or to that of a class would not be the same as in the dominant conceptions of political power in the West. In fact, using an argument that Jyotiba Phule had made earlier, he argued that colonial authority itself in India had to reluctantly reckon with this fact. For the purpose, he divided the development of colonial authority in India into three phases. Initially, it tried to situate itself within the institutions and processes of legitimacy that Mughal power or other previous holders had devised or opted for. But soon, colonial authority in India attempted to constitute its own instrumentality of legitimacy. But such attempts to seek legitimacy on its own terms came to be strongly rebuffed through widespread violence, and the mutiny of 1857 itself was one of its expressions. Therefore, eventually, colonial power came to garner its own legitimacy by co-opting a section of the upper caste to its rules, or by simply pandering to their susceptibilities. And this argument is, those of you who have read Sudipta Kaviraj of enumerated communities, is quite different from that kind of an argument. What was the difference in the way power was structured in India? Here, Ambedkar did not distinguish between status and power as much as different forms of power. For Ambedkar, status itself was a form of power. He thought that those who wield ideological power and make people to accept their condition through symbols, rituals, learning, and command over institutions definitely have an edge over direct wielders of coercive violence. One of the trajectories of the dialectics of history in India that he proposed was the tension between these two modes of wielding power, between Shudras and Brahmins, between Vashishta and Vishwamitra, etc. And, the quotations go on. This mode of organizing power ostensibly seems diffused in an institutional sense, while it is highly united in an ideological sense. He thought that this ideological unity favors the Brahmin vis-a-vis other wielders of power, by stipulating and vetoing the choices of others and deciding their station in life, by denying to others the right to choose the purposes of their life, and the instrumentalities and resources required for the same, and by instituting certain structured, social and cultural ways of life as the only legitimate way of engaging in social life. The role of the direct wielders of power comes in only when such ideological power is threatened. The hold of the Brahmin, therefore, is universal, while that of the Kshatriya is local. A poor Brahmin often wields much more power than those who wield economic resources. It is not merely that power is irreducible to the economy, but often other sides of power may even overwhelm the economic domain. In the Annihilation of Caste, he develops a persuasive argument that unless one accords priority to annihilate social relations embedded in the caste system, class relations cannot be engaged with in any unobtrusive way. In India, there are not merely a different way of structuring power, he argues, but there are significant differences in stipulating such differences itself. While all such different ways of constituting difference may not find universal endorsement among the adherents of these differences, disregarding the ways of the others could reinforce differences. Ambedkar brought an entire performative act of display of the Muslim League to demonstrate how the Congress, by making the slogan secular its private property, looks down majestically at the minorities to follow its lead without being self-critical of its own social basis of power. In Thoughts on Pakistan, he argued that Muslims and non-Muslims have amassed in their respective camps enough discursive ammunition to elicit the compliance of a large number of their co-religionists, which would make the partition of India a fait accompli unless an alternative discourse reconstructs the domains they share in common as fundamental, and the differences across them would not pose an obstacle to a shared political life. The second type of power, authoritative texts, traditions, customs, and personages as sites of power. What do they do? What do texts, traditions, customs, and personages do? They prescribe and proscribe, prohibit and endorse, persuade and suggest, uphold and condemn certain ways of life, some form of action rather than another. In the third dimensional notion of power of Luke's. In the process, they endorse certain roles rather than others. They hide issues and concerns and uphold others. They project certain actions as desirable and condemn others. While all texts do it, there are some of them which become hallowed by becoming part of a culture. The kind of self and persons they propose suggest them in turn, refer to them, and transform them as authoritative. Therefore, they become power in themselves, power in terms of directing and ordering the lives of others, without factoring in their choice and interest. This is particularly the case with regard to texts that come to be considered as sacrosanct. Therefore, all texts need to be validated, as well as traditions and customs, but particularly the so-called religious texts, which call out authoritative injunctions. Given his political priorities of annihilating caste and abolition of untouchability, he of course focused on Hindu Shastras, but this could apply to any Shastra. Among the Shastras, the most important was Manusmriti, from which he quoted extensively and sometimes ad nauseam. It is a text that he considered regulatory. It was unimportant to him whether the text was invoked on a day-to-day basis or not. A text has an extended and expansive life by becoming a tradition, custom, and mode of living, whose authoritative course gets reflected and sanctioned eventually through the text. A text might be invoked in an ultimate sense, and everyday life might go on without invoking this ultimate. What was important, however, is from where the ultimate legitimacy comes from. In the annihilation of caste, he argued that the authority of the Shastras has to be destroyed if you wish to annihilate caste. In the Constitution of India, and particularly in the Hindu Code Bill, he goes about instituting social relations, setting aside codes that govern caste and untouchability, and reinstituting social relations on the basis of equality and autonomy of discrete citizens, the idea of democracy that I suggested earlier. Texts also can be facilitators and help. They open up our horizons and suggest to us ways of going about. They make us aware of domains that we had ignored and warn us of pitfalls and dangers. They argue the case for how to be human and help us to engage with embedded customs and traditions which can be dehumanizing. We can see the Buddha processing a whole body of literature which went in the name of 62 systems of philosophy, apart from Brahmanical philosophy, critically endorsing the views of some and rejecting those of others, eventually proposing his own distinct path of what it means to be human. So in a way, for Ambedkar, Buddha becomes the text writ large. Ambedkar also felt that text can be misread to endorse one's own stand and thereby serve the interests of social clusters, and as he thought, he was tended to do with the Gita. A third source of power, limiting and confining social action and thereby heightening the significance of some institutions rather than another. This is a charge that he brought before the social reforms agenda in India, before Marxists, before the Bhakti Friends, and above all before Gandhi. This was also his charge against organizing power in the liberal democratic movement. He thought that while the idea of social reforms, which called for the equality, freedoms, and participation of hitherto excluded members, and thereby endorsed equal rights in actual fact, was limited to reforms among upper castes. Such attempts often identify discrete factors rather than see structures, as in the case of the caste system or untouchability. By bracketing social reforms within certain confines, these attempts left an entire mass of humanity outside their purview. They also helped to consolidate a part as a whole, as the Indian nation threatened to become. This is how, for instance, he saw Ranaday's otherwise valiant attempts at social reforms. For instance, therefore, there is an appreciation for Ranaday, and there is also a critique of Ranaday in Ambedkar's also pointed out that the ambivalence of such attempts. Once you have invoked equal rights, you cannot foreclose them. By confining them, however, to some, you precipitate a constituency which becomes a power in itself to contend against. He charged Marxists for such an occluded vision, who spoke the language of class and class struggle, without looking into factors which prevented a class being fused together, both at the place of production, at sites of reproduction, and in domains of struggle and theory building. He taught that even the Bhakti saints, who hailed from the untouchable communities, such as Chokamela, focused attention on the equality of the devotee before his/her God, rather than argue and fight for equality in social relations, in this worldly affairs. The Bhakti poets little challenged the rituals and customs that kept them out of or confined their own commitments. Ambedkar charges Gandhi for letting the untouchable to bear his full burden and promising him the conversion of the hearts of the upper caste. In other words, Gandhi called for a moral conversion and left the rest of the faith to the untouchables, without considering whether such an appeal was acceptable or repugnant to his audience. The activities of the Harijan Sevak Sangh held the upper caste as the model for imitation, instead of attacking a despicable institution, and sought to make the Harijan acceptable to the upper caste. The fourth type of power, representational consideration. There is some ambiguity in Ambedkar with regard to representational consideration. The first concerns universal, unmarked representation with certain special consideration extended to the minorities. An argument that he developed in his evidence before the Simon Commission on one hand, and separate representation to social constituencies marked by difference. This is a continuous engagement. In the latter case, that is where he argues for weightage to minorities, in the latter case, he sometimes extends such representation to minorities not merely in the legislature, but in other organs of power as well. He also seeks adequate representation to ensure that a political system is not able to marginalize the minorities. This is, for instance, his argument in States and Minorities, written in 1947. Sometimes, however, he tends to suggest that in contexts where there are distinct social groups with deep antagonisms across them, representatives should hail from the concerned ethnic group itself. He also feels that it is not enough that representatives hail from the concerned ethnic group, but they should be considered by the ethnic communities as their authentic representatives, and they in turn prove themselves as such. He remains deeply suspicious of the system of reservation of representation through joint electorate instituted by the Pune Pact, and these apprehensions continue to be present even after the system of reserved political representation through joint electorate was endorsed by the Constitution. Ambedkar's apprehension with regard to such representational devices was obvious. In joint electorate, the majority can always outwit the minority, and the representative, although he hails from minority or disadvantaged group, can continue to endorse the interests of the majority to ensure that he continues to get elected from a particular constituency. For the time being, I need not belabor the problem that he is advocating of descriptive representation leads us to. And I think Ambedkar is caught in a trap here. But the trap is, if you actually begin to think the issue in terms of the representational logic, because he thinks that he would be able to escape from it by suggesting a higher concept to resolve this issue. That is, high concept is the concept of democracy. The fifth site of dominance. For Ambedkar, economic dominance was one of the sources of dominance, manifest in the concentration of social produce in a few hands, and thereby directing the lives of others and constraining the options of the latter. And therefore, some of the commentators have read Ambedkar as sympathetic to Marxism, which I don't think he was. For him, the ideological and juridical forms in which such dominance comes to be expressed is an important issue for consideration, because they make economic class exploitation legitimate and bearable. Such ideological power is akin to that of domination. A solution that he advanced in this regard is bringing in the basic industries under public control and institute regulations to govern the rest of the economy. His arguments for mixed economy almost mirrored those of John Stuart Mill, and particularly in context those of Pandit Nehru. Ambedkar built up the argument that economic dominance can affect the life prospects of others deleteriously, that there is little justification for concentration of means of production in a few hands. The initiative in this regard should lie with the state. Now, you don't have to be a Marxist to say all this. Several liberal states. The moral basis of the political community. Ambedkar's response to the increasing tilt of political power in a statist direction was to call for a moral basis for power in the non-essentialist foundations of Buddhism. I'm not elaborating this argument, because this is an argument that is done in the Buddha and his Dhamma. So one of the ways of resolving some of the dilemmas that I have pointed out is by constituting a higher court of appeal in terms of a moral basis for society. But those of you who are familiar with the Buddha and Dhamma, Ambedkar argues that that moral basis cannot be stipulated on the basis of an entity, but should be based upon a non-essentialist kind of an argumentation. So now, if this is the case, if this is a critique of power, what is the place of the state? So Ambedkar actually begins to see the state now as an instrument of both dominance and as an enabling agency. State could become, if whatever I have said so far makes sense, state could become an instrument of domination or an enabling institution. A state that considers itself as the embodiment of common good without factoring in difference and culturally embedded nature of power could prove to be highly authoritarian, even though it claims to be liberal with hyphen democracy. On the other hand, a state can also factor in difference and other cultural markers and could become an enabling institution. As an enabling power, it could also reinforce ethical democracy and reform social relations afresh. Ethical democracy is a term that I am using to denote, we make the distinction between political democracy and social and economic democracy. Social and economic democracy is a democracy understood as a way of life, and I have called it as ethical democracy, the comprehensive notion. Now there are several specific issues that Ambedkar suggests, and I am not going into it. Ambedkar thinks very highly of constitutionalism or rule of law as a significant consideration to be pursued, and thinks several instrumentalities of government, almost in a similar vein to rescue the way Max Weber does. It's interesting, Ambedkar thinks that it is important to have an oppositional party. In fact, in the 1940 famous essay on Gandhi and Jinnah, he begins to say that you need to have an opposition. he charges Srinivas Shastri that he has deserted the role of being a statesman by caving into the Congress. So there is an argument for political parties, a very strong argument for parliamentary democracy, and there are the arguments for checks and balances. There is an acknowledgement for a judiciary, but at the same time, an argument that the role of the judiciary itself needs to be checkmated through a kind of a popular accountability. I'm not going into this particular case. Let me now develop some kind of critique and ampare that this kind of argument on the stage leads to. And I'm just going to state them, not develop, six what I think are problems that this kind of a conception of the state faces. Ambedkar does not seem to be giving much credence that power can be hugely alienating, particularly state power. This is the argument of Anupama Rao. And Ambedkar does not seem to be paying much attention to this particular issue. But he does not seem to be taking cognizance of the fact that the project of state will inevitably reinforce apparatuses of the state, particularly the bureaucracy. The second argument, second problem that I feel in his writing on the larger issue of representational consideration, he does not seem to give much attention to the fact that he actually begins to talk about a universal unmarked representation. Second one is a marked representation, which some people have described as descriptive representation. But he also begins to talk about authenticity in terms of representation. But who is authentic? And how do you guarantee authenticity over time? And can one be authentic and at the same time be the upholder of universal interests? Now, this is the vicious circle in which descriptive representation runs into, and some of the big problems that multiculturalism, the arguments of people like Anne Irish Malayalam confront us today that beyond a particular point, it looks very interesting, but beyond a particular point, any kind of universal and civilizational project becomes impossible. And Ambedkar seems to be a little oblivious to this particular argument. My third problem, in many ways, Ambedkar's understanding of Hinduism is naive. He thought that eventually Hinduism would give in to the tradition of reason and compassion epitomized by Buddhism. And the kind of shift that significant intellectuals like Pandit Nehru were making towards Buddhism, he thought would lead to either the weakening of Hinduism in India or a resurgence of Hinduism through the lens of Buddhism, which I think it is very nice because it was a very limited understanding of Hinduism. Jewish influence suggested the possibility of a common secular sense and its non-essentialism at the same time, and therefore he began to reach out to Buddhism, and reconstruct Buddhism in the duty and through the John Dewey lens as a non-essentialist, as not committed to a kind of an entelechy, etc. My fourth problem with Ambedkar's this argument is probably he thought, and this is not developed, he thought that a strong communitarian base for the democracy in India, held together by language, community and ethnicity would persist without their power projection. If you look at the way Ambedkar handles the linguistic issue, And the way he actually reaches out to people like Jawaharlal on the Adivasi question, some evidence can be drawn, because he thinks that no matter what happens, some communitarian basis of support for democracy in India would sustain themselves over time, and it is unlikely to become atomized as in the West, leading probably to the process of bureaucratization. But the argument itself is not very strongly developed, but it is suggested. But however you look at it, Ambedkar's state was a big state and would have led to interventions in several walks of life. Instead of reinforcing democracy, it would have entrenched itself more and more with its developmental and reformative agendas. In the process, the state would have become an end in itself rather than an instrumentality to foster democracy. And Ambedkar doesn't seem to be suggesting a way out of it. And my last problem is, the moral agenda that he was proposing through Buddhism appeared eminently reasonable in the context, but did it have the power to tilt the scale?